Hello, good afternoon. My name is Georg Zachmann. I'm a senior fellow at Bruegel, and I'm very happy to welcome you here and also on the screens to an event on electricity market design. And I know it's a busy day in Brussels today with a lot of legal proposals being presented and quite substantive one, so I'm very happy that you could join us here, and I'm even more happy that Jürgensen could join us today, the Director General from DG Enner. As you certainly know when you're here, it's also a topical week on electricity market design because the European Commission proposed its reform plan for the electricity market. I'm not sure whether we can already call it the fifth electricity market package or the 4.5th one. But it is, in my view, heralding actually a certain paradigm shift away from a market vision that we had in the 90s towards a market vision that is more geared towards investments, and we'll come to that. Now, the agenda for today is that I'll give you a 10 minutes presentation because we have a new paper on electricity market design that should help those of you that are not too deep into electricity markets to understand a bit better what we are discussing, because we think this discussion will go on for quite a while, and it's a very complex and deep discussion with 20, 30 years of baggage, so you better get well equipped to take part into that debate. And then Didier Jürgensen will give us some thoughts on the Commission's proposal. We do a bit of discussion on the panel and then give it to you for questions. So with that, Katja, can you please put on the slides? Next slide. Oh, sorry, I have a machine here. Okay. So the general idea is, why we are kind of focusing in this important week on electricity market design, is that I believe that electricity is kind of the crucial fuel of the future for Europe. It's essentially the energy vector. It is clean electricity is set to become the dominant fuel, and while we today discuss about gas and oil and coal markets, in the future we will mainly discuss about electricity when we discuss about cheap energy for Europe, and therefore getting this right, this market right, is going to be essential, and the current reform is one of the stepping stones toward that, because 2035, 2040, 2050 are not that far away anymore, especially when you think in investment cycles. The reforms that we are discussing, they affect massively the cost of electricity services and also the distribution of those costs and benefits between consumers. And as I said, we have this paper out. I think it's now on the website, with which we want to contribute to this complex topic. So what I want to do is to introduce you first a set of first principles, because we think it's necessary to go back to first principles when discussing electricity market design, because it's such a complex topic. Otherwise, we are going to get lost in the very devilish details. Then think about conceptual implications of certain reforms that we can do. Then have a short discussion and a bit provocative one on the Commission proposal, so I hope to get a bit of discussion going on that, and then a few recommendations from our side. So the starting point is that we wanted to do an electricity market reform last year. The Commission President announced that to deal with the crisis of 2022 and maybe 2023 in terms of high prices, but that's not the only issue that we need to solve. We also have a second issue, which is we need to get fit for 2050 for a fully decarbonized system, and this system is going to look drastically different from the system we have. So we will essentially see a doubling of the electricity demand by 2050. We see essentially no more role of a variable cost in the classic sense that we had in the past. We see significantly more decentralization, many more actors in many more places playing a role. We hopefully will see digitalization that will enable some of those developments, and we see new demand sectors, heat pumps, electric vehicles, that might be able to be much more responsive on the demand side. So the system that we are heading for is a system that the existing market was not designed for. I think that's fair to say. So therefore, current market reform proposals need to take into account that we will go for a different world. Now, what should an electricity market kind of try to achieve? Both for the current system and for the future system. First, it should try to achieve optimal dispatch. So optimal dispatch is when the wind blows in the Netherlands, then in Germany, coal-fired power plants are being switched off. And optimal dispatch is that if somebody can reduce its consumption when there is too little electricity in the system, they should be incentivized to do so. Current system, in my view, is quite efficient in doing that. I think last year was a tremendous testament to this capability. France lost about half of its nuclear park, and still the European system was able to essentially keep them afloat. I think the main difficulty, in my view, in the current system that we still haven't overcome is that locational signals for operation of the system are not yet ideal. Otherwise, I think we are maybe at 95% or so. In the future, I think we need, however, to be more cognizant of the challenges in terms of decentralized generation and flexibilities. So to make sure that we get those locational signals for also smaller scale producers and consumers to play in a system-friendly way in this new system. The second element is fairness. Fairness has been an element that has been largely ignored in past electricity market reforms. We have not looked so deeply into the distributional effects. If you look into old impact assessments, it's not so often mentioned. But last year was showing that this is a very important topic. So we saw skyrocketing electricity wholesale prices, which led to higher retail prices at the one hand. On the other hand, higher revenues of electricity producers, not necessarily higher returns, because also the cost of some of the electricity producers increased. But we saw a significant shifting of welfare here, and that had political consequences. And I think the current reform discussion is one of those consequences. But also in the future system, we should be more aware of fairness considerations. So for example, how do we distribute the cost of the transition? If we, for example, allow consumers to essentially get out of the network and only pay for the electricity they consume net, while they have kind of their own solar panel and own batteries, then they might not carry the full cost of the system anymore and put those costs on other parts, other users. And that might be unfair because richer households might be more able to install a solar panel than poorer households. Just one example of many examples that we will have to consider when discussing fairness of the future system. The third objective, and that's the last big objective here, is efficient investment. And I think that is the focus of the current reform. The current system did not deliver investments in line with the ambition. We had too little investments. And it also led to the wrong investments in the wrong places. So we did not have any European coordination or optimization. We also had no real kind of coordination in terms of which technologies are fitting nicely together to provide the cheapest energy. And in the future, the system will only be getting bigger. So the future investment needs are supposed to essentially double from the past, and more complex coordination is needed because we have many more actors, many more technologies across Europe in a very volatile system. So what are the conceptual choices to address those three objectives? And I think here we are really back to the drawing board from the 1990s. So when in the 1990s the green and the white paper were there about what do we do with the European electricity market, these were the choices we were confronted with. Do we want a system where more incentives are provided by the state in order to decide which power plants run, how fairness is ensured, and how investments are done, or do we relinquish it to kind of the play of markets? Do we give more powers to a European level, either state or market, or to national? And do we try to find solutions that are very centralized in a sense of, for example, TSOs saying what is the amount of flexibility we need and then organizing a market, or decentralized by having more bilateral contracts? So essentially, the question is who is responsible for what, and that's shifting with the proposal that the Commission has been making on state guarantees for PPAs, on capacity and allowing national capacity mechanisms, on contracts for difference. This balance is being shifted, and the question is: are we really understanding who is going to be responsible for what in the future? Now. The Commission proposal in those kind of when looking into those three objectives, my take would be in terms of optimal dispatch, there are some changes in details like gate closure hours that are set to improve the system. In terms of efficient investment, I think it's the focus of the reform. So we have a new chapter 3 where for the first time, in my view, the Commission essentially says that that these investment incentives by states are being acknowledged. So it's not anymore that it goes to DG Comp or something, but there is essentially a tool already in the directive. My take would be that there is too little oversight essentially on the member states' interventions here, that member states are let too free in doing very inconsistent approaches that will potentially lead us to a system that is highly inefficient and overbuilt and not fit for purpose. And then the third element is in terms of fairness. Here, the main narrative, and I fully subscribe to that, is more and hopefully better investment will lead to lower prices in the long term. So that is certainly, I subscribe to that. And then there are a few more rules on tighter rules for retailers, some framework for crisis interventions that are there to protect consumers. My big worry with the proposal is that the secondary effects and the system effects of the individual interventions are not really assessed in a systematic way. So we do not really understand what, if we introduce a lot of CFDs, what will happen for the rest of the system. For me, the governance system is a bit unclear in terms of who is going to coordinate what. So who is to blame if the things go wrong in the end? And I think it needs a bit more time to understand kind of and scrutinize how the effects are going to look like. So what we would recommend is the first statement is wrong investment in signals would be extremely expensive. So we have some studies from some member states that say if you go one way, you save dozens of billions per year compared to another plan of investment. So I think we need to be very careful of the direction we go there, and we need to discuss the principles again before we can jump into setting the very devilish details, because I mean many of you know it from kind of these regulatory discussions. In the end, it boils down to very small details, but we need a consistent architecture before we can decide on in which color we paint the kitchen. And then my second recommendation here would be we need the power of granular price signals. So the energy-only market that has hopefully locational signals and temporary signals is extremely powerful in telling us when there is scarcity in a certain load situation. And this signal, for me, is not only there to decide on the dispatch, but it also needs to be there to decide on optimal investments, because this might tell us in the end whether it makes sense to build a certain hydrogen plant somewhere or to build a battery in another place. So we need these granular market signals because they are the best indicator we have for actual scarcity and need. So for that, because that will take time to get right, we suggest a sort of a phased reform. First, I think the consumer protection elements can go ahead quickly. We think it will take time to discuss the investment framework on a European level. So therefore, in the short term, we might have some European instrument for supporting renewables as a bridge for 1 to 3 years, to have more time for a really deep discussion on a real fifth package to discuss then. And that all should, in our view, be complemented with kind of the proper modeling and data needed to analyze that. So we need a European level electricity system development model. We need a European level electricity market model to be able to understand what those individual proposals are actually doing to optimal dispatch fairness and investment in the system. And with that rushed through a 30-page paper, I close here and would like to give the floor to Ditte, and it would be great if you can kind of illuminate us a bit on what you have been proposing on Tuesday.
Very much, Georg. Thank you very much for the invitation to come here, and a very impressive and clear, swift version of the 30 pages. So congratulations on that, and on the interesting paper, which I think is going to help in some of the discussions and reflections that will take place across Europe over the coming months on the proposal for electricity market design. Because despite all its technical complexity and challenges, it is a piece of legislation, or pieces of legislation, that are extremely important for our energy systems, our security, our transition towards a more sustainable energy system, a more climate-friendly energy system, for the affordability of the energy we offer consumers, households, businesses. But it's also important for our competitiveness and how we see Europe developing more generally in the current both economic context, but also the current geopolitical context and expectations for that. So all of that technical complexity has to fit into what are the overall strategic objectives that we're seeking to achieve with the proposal and in our energy system. And in that sense, I think you're right, Georg. We're really looking here at a proposal that is taking us a step into the future. We're really trying to look ahead into what is needed in the energy system as we get towards 2030 and beyond. And as you have said, we're going to see a significant increase. The expectation, the objective is to see a significant increase in the electrification in our energy system. So higher shares of electricity as an energy carrier in our system over the coming decades. It's more energy efficient. So to achieve our climate targets, we do need to have higher shares of electricity. And it is possible to produce it in a clean way through renewable energy, renewable electricity generation in particular. So there are many good reasons for this higher level of electricity in the system. And that is one of the things we've called for in our energy system integration strategy that was presented at the beginning of this mandate. And so to some extent, you can say the step we're taking with this proposal is a natural follow-up both from those strategic objectives and the plans we have set ourselves, and then is also a natural follow-up to the crisis response, all the measures we took over the last 12 months to make sure we could address the crisis, limit the risks, limit the impact as much as possible of the energy crisis for European consumers, households, businesses again. And so I think you need to look at this proposal really as being part of those different strands of work, and hopefully bringing these different objectives together, the longer term strategic objectives, together with the need to make sure we have a system that also works in the coming years. So as you have put it, Georg, and I fully agree with you, this is not just a response to the 22, 23, 24, 25, 26 crisis, because I think we need to talk of the crisis in more than just this winter and next winter. It's also a response to 2030, 2040, 2050, really taking the first steps into that. So that framing, I think, is important to have in mind. And yet, we are not in a situation where we can or should revolutionize the electricity market. The electricity market design, as you've said, has been built over several decades, and it has on the whole served us very well over the last years. It has helped bring investments, it has brought interconnectors, and so it really has helped us get into a system that is more sustainable, that is more secure, and that is more affordable. It's not a perfect system yet, it's been a development, but it has served us well, including in the context of ensuring security of supply. We had the first ever truly global energy crisis. That truly global energy crisis had its epicenter in Europe over the last 12 months. And we have not seen blackouts. We have seen a system that worked. You mentioned the challenges in French output from nuclear. The system actually worked, thanks to what has been put in place. So in making a proposal for changing the electricity market design, we need to look at what is it we need to maintain. What are the elements in the system that have been critical for achieving what we have achieved so far? And what are the elements in the system that can be improved, tweaked, that can evolve rather than be revolutionized, that can evolve to be a better fit for the changing energy system, the changing global energy context that we're in, and our aims to achieve climate neutrality in 2050. So that is some of the reflection that has gone into this. We've talked a lot about the electricity market over the last 12 months. It's a tricky topic to discuss politically, again, because of the technical complexities and the physical realities of an electricity market. And I think it has been a useful conversation over that year in parallel to the crisis response, like the revenue cap and other things, that we've had the time to further develop the thinking on, well, what are the aspects of our electricity market design that we do need to align, again, with that step into the future towards 2030 and beyond. We have set ourselves 3 fundamental objectives in this, and again, responding both to what we've seen over the last year, the challenges that the electricity market and electricity prices have brought, but also responding to the need for further electrification and more investments into renewables. So our key objectives in that context are, first of all, to limit the impact that high fossil prices, high natural gas prices in particular, have on retail, on the bills, on what consumers pay. So limit the impact of that price volatility and those very high prices as much as possible. The second objective, as you have also identified, is we're going to need significantly increased investments into renewable capacity over the coming years. And the sooner the better, the more the better. And so we need to make sure that we increase the incentives for investments into renewables. And certainly we have to make sure we don't do anything that pushes in the other direction. And I mentioned that second aspect, the somewhat negative aspect, let's not do something that creates problems. The reason I mention is that one of the things we've seen during the crisis are some short-term national measures that have created a little bit of uncertainty in the market, and investors, project developers, market participants respond fairly quickly to that. And so a structural change to the electricity market would need to bring some calm, predictability, stability into the market and avoid those short-term changes that create uncertainty. That's not a good thing for investments, essentially. So incentivizing investments into renewables is a second objective. And a third objective is to empower consumers, to make sure that consumers actually have more of a choice in choosing greener electricity, different forms of electricity, that they have more guarantees in the market, that they're not quite as vulnerable to the significant volatility we have seen in prices, or that they have, even if they do not have a house where they can install photovoltaic, that they have a possibility to choose renewable electricity for their own consumption and benefit from the lower cost renewables. So those are the 3 key objectives we have set ourselves, and that we have try to make sure that what we are proposing aligns with those. A lot of the things we're proposing in the text is actually responding to several of these objectives. There's a significant interlinkage, if you will, between these 3 objectives. I'll come back to that. But maybe before I say a few words on how we're suggesting to improve our electricity market design towards those objectives, maybe just a brief word about the public consultation, because we carried out a public consultation earlier this year. We didn't have the luxury of many months, but it was, I think, a fairly focused and a fairly clear public consultation. And luckily, it was also a popular public consultation, in the sense there was a lot of interest. We received a lot of good replies and a lot of useful input into that. We had more of 1,000 replies, 1,369 in total. About half of them came from citizens and the other half from stakeholders, operators, project developers, member states. So really a fairly wide response in what was quite a short time frame available for the consultation. So that has been very, very helpful for us in drafting this proposal. There was a lot of good input there. So our proposal is accompanied by a staff working document that goes through the responses to the public consultations, that clarifies how have we looked at it, how do we analyze these responses, this input, but it also looks at what have been the policy options that we have discussed and how would we assess the impact of those. So it is not a full impact assessment that takes more than the time we have had, but there has been a good assessment of impact in the context of the staff working document and linked to the public consultations. We closed the public consultations with an online workshop in February, a lot of participants and very, very good discussion around that. So again, a good opportunity for us also to test our ideas and see, is this direction one that aligns well with the overall analysis out there from stakeholders and others. And what was one of the interesting things in this discussion is that what we have seen is actually a fairly high degree of convergence around some main principles and issues. And coming out of this year of energy crisis and swift responses, crisis measures, but also difficult political discussions around some of the aspects, it's quite good to see that the fundamentals of the market met large convergence, large consensus across stakeholders, across communities. And just to outline briefly where we have seen most respondents come together. The first one is we need the short-term markets to continue to function. They function well. They are critical in our system, critical in a dispatch context, in a stability context, in a security of supply context. And so essentially everyone out there recognizes that we're not going in to change that. That is a factor of the market that works. Linked to that, and again, high degree of convergence around it, is that we need to strengthen the longer term price signals. So the long-term market is less developed in many countries across the European Union, and that needs to be strengthened. Contracts for difference, power purchasing agreements, forward markets, and see, well, what is the right balance between these different tools, but a clear recognition that that longer-term aspect is critical for the longer-term development of our market. Another aspect and linked into that that has met a high degree of consensus in the discussions and in the public consultation is the need for more flexibility in the system, more demand response, more developed demand response and storage mechanisms. You pointed to that as well in your paper. If we look at this energy system that is significantly more electrified, with significantly higher levels of renewables, and it's clear our ability to store, our ability to design the system in a way that is more that has a more flexible approach, more flexible demand and demand response, including through digitalization, then that is a necessary element of that. So again, an important aspect looking into the future of the electricity market. And then of course, or not of course, but also a high degree of convergence around consumer protection. It's essential. And in that context, there's quite a lot of interest and again convergence around the fact that we need to align consumer protection with the necessary demand response and the necessary incentives in the system, so that there is a reaction in times of high prices, for example, or higher prices, for example. And then there was a number of comments on our emergency measures. I mentioned previously the revenue cap, and there was not a great appetite, I think it's fair to say, out there for including the revenue cap as a more structural measure, and so we have taken due note of that as well. So what is it we are suggesting in the proposal that was presented on Tuesday? First of all, I mentioned the energy bills of European consumers, and making those energy bills, what people and companies actually pay, less dependent on the short-term market price of electricity. And again, obviously that short-term market price is very often driven by natural gas prices in particular, as the marginal and price-setting energy source or energy carrier for that. So what are we doing to limit that dependence, that price dependence, and to build the longer-term markets? I have a feeling I'm losing this one. I think it's still there. My apologies. So what are we doing there? First of all, we are seeking to improve the way the long-term markets work. That would be done by facilitating and boosting the market of power purchasing agreements, the PPAs, removing what we see as current barriers in the system that hinder the development, and in particular the way this impacts small and medium-sized enterprises that have less impact to these longer-term contracts, these more stable, price-stable mechanism. We are also suggesting to stabilize the prices of electricity and curbing the excessive revenues of energy producers by requiring the use of two-way contracts for difference for what are new investments that involve state aid, that involve public funding into low-carbon generation. And that can be new investments into existing facilities if there is a significant investment, if there's a real new feature in the generation, or it can be investment into completely new generation. If there's state aid, then contract for difference is a necessary part of price setting and of addressing that. And then, as I've mentioned before, we see forward markets as being insufficiently developed. We see an interest and a need to further develop those forward markets, again, in this longer-term price setting and price stability context. And so we're making suggestions to further improve those, make them more liquid and integrate them better, including a link between the markets to the actual transmission rights. So it's a bit of discrepancy now in that transmission rights are typically shorter term, and so you can buy into the forward market, but if you do not link it into transmission, then that can become a problem in how the system actually works. The second objective, as I mentioned, is really accelerating our deployment of renewables by incentivizing investments into renewables and thereby helping the faster reduction of natural gas, the phase out of natural gas as part of our electricity system. And so we have a number of suggestions that will facilitate the integration of renewables into our system and improving the conditions for the flexibility solutions that are a necessary component or a necessary complement to this higher share renewable we have in our system. Demand response, storage, essentially the different technologies, mechanisms that are weather independent and that can help have a system with higher shares of the intermittent renewables. And in that, in relation to renewables, one of the very important aspects, in particular when we talk renewables at significant scale, is to make it easier to put in place the large, for example, offshore wind farms that are shared between different countries, where we try to make it clearer that there will be access for the energy that is coming out of that. We also have short-term market efficiencies there so that it is easier to trade renewable electricity into that. You mentioned the gate closure, and that is actually an important point if you're a renewable generator where there's a degree of uncertainty about your generation depending on weather. And then I mentioned the flexibility services. We're suggesting measures to facilitate and incentivize the procurement of those services, again, as a necessary complement to this more renewable-based electricity market in Europe that we're making our way towards. Of course, in terms of incentivizing investments into renewables, the first category, the power purchasing agreements, the contracts for difference, the forward markets as well, those are also important aspects in the sense that they can allow secure access to finance for project developers through PPAs or through contract for difference. They can help create price stability and market stability, so a really important component as well, both for the prices that consumers pay, but also very much for project development and for the incentives for renewables. And then the third aspect, I mentioned consumer protection, consumer empowerment. And there are different aspects to that consumer protection and empowerment. One is the price aspect. What do consumers pay? A second one is the security of supply. Is there a supplier for all consumers at all times? And the third one is the consumer choice in terms of what kind of energy would you want to buy as a consumer, and that is both households and businesses, of course. So one is that we suggest to establish a supplier of last resort, an obligation that in each market there is a supplier of last resort. We have seen over the last year some energy companies that have not been able to continue supplying, and so we've seen consumers that have been put in a precarious situation as a result of that. If you're a vulnerable consumer, then that has been a problem. We need to make sure we address that. I do think I have lost. Can anyone hear what I'm saying still? Because this one does seem to has made his own way. Thank you. Thank you very much. There's the choice if they want. Now it works. If they want fixed price contracts, well, then that option should be available to them. And of course, if that is a right for consumers, well, then that right is mirrored by an obligation on suppliers to offer fixed price contracts. And again, that obligation on suppliers to offer fixed price contracts requires that suppliers do some hedging. If you offer a long-term contract, if you're bound into a certain price, well, you also need to make sure that you can actually offer that without risks for your own financial stability, and so those prudential obligations on suppliers are linked to that consumer right. We also, as I mentioned, believe that it's important, necessary to empower consumers to choose their electricity mix to a higher degree than what they do now. As you mentioned, it's not everyone that can install their own photovoltaic, and so trying to find options for consumers to share in renewable electricity, even if it's not in their own market, is an important part of this aspect, and giving consumers the possibility to benefit from several suppliers, having several meters, depending on what is their domestic setup, if you both have heat pumps and an electric car and other large aspects, users in your household, well, then that can be relevant, and again for a number of consumers. And then what we have seen during this time of crisis again is that there has been a need to intervene on retail prices and prices for small and medium-sized enterprises. And in order to create clarity and certainty around that, what are the conditions? When is there a crisis? When can member states intervene for households? We suggest a provision that would make it possible to intervene in times of crisis with respect to household and small and medium-sized enterprises. And then my last point, which covers all of these different objectives in one, and that is when you, one of the things we have experienced over the last years is we need more transparency, we need better monitoring, we need to make sure regulators have the tools that regulators need. So we are also, in the context of this reform, suggesting changes to REMIT, suggesting a strengthening of the role of ACER in terms of investigations of cross-border cases, suggesting a harmonization of fines, and suggesting better data collection and better market monitoring. So I think it's a natural component. If you improve the rules, if you strengthen the rules, make sure that you also have the data, the monitoring and the enforcement that will make sure that these changes have the effect that they should have. So that is the last component. I took a lot more time than I had promised. My apologies for that. But there's a lot to talk about in electricity market design. Please.
And your document was much longer than ours. So, maybe I can kick off with one question that is on in your view, who is going to essentially coordinate the choices of kind of power plant development in Europe? Is it going to be because my understanding is we have a lot of actors now being involved. If I read the proposal, then I see that the market operators might have some obligation to act as market makers for longer term contracts. We see that the TSOs will have to some job in assessing what the flexibility needs are. The regulators will have to kind of observe whether that's okay. The member states do legislation on how they are going to support PPAs and how their national CFDs are going to look like. The Commission is also looking over that, but. And then companies in this relatively complex framework are going to be faced with all sorts of incentives from different players. Can we be sure that we are kind of converging to somewhat of a sensible power plant mix in the future based on that mechanism? Is it going to be consistent? Is there something that is kind of driving us back to kind of always like a rubber band back to kind of an efficient system, or is there the risk that we are essentially exploding in a system where everybody is going in his own direction, and in the end we are going to see massive renationalization of power mixes because the Germans are supporting their 21 gigawatts of gas plants, and they are not going to share that with somebody else because they are paying for it.
You do make it sound very complex, so I grant you that. I have a slightly different assessment analysis of it, and that is what has gone into our proposals and how we see it. So first of all, I think we have established and strengthened significantly the governance system of European energy markets over the last years with the Clean Energy for All package, with national energy and climate plans, with a significantly increased degree of coordination at the level of the European Union with national governments. I also think we have clarified in our governance system the role of transmission system operators and the European network of transmission system operators. So I think we have some very strong components of our governance system that work well together. Third point in that is that we work, as I mentioned in the beginning of my very long introductory remarks, there's recognition of the need to maintain the short-term markets and the signals, and and this is not a revolution. We're not taking away the functioning of the market. We are strengthening the market and helping to strengthen some of the investment signals that are necessary in that market. And so, in other words, your rubber band, bringing it back to the market, yes, I think that the market design is sufficiently strong and sufficiently improved with this proposal that will help drive the direction of investments and planning that are made. Having said that, the energy mix is a national competence. It is up to member states themselves to plan that. And so I think that European governance that can help bring it together is an important aspect of that. And I do think this reform will further strengthen that and will help drive in the right direction. I think the energy crisis we're in, the very, very high fossil prices, the uncertainty around global fossil markets, and even the negative signals from those markets, because there is a supply-demand challenge in natural gas in particular. I think that will further help drive those investments. So I'm not worried about that. I think you can always ask for, could we have a simpler model? But we do have to find a balance between a centralized system and a market-based system where the decisions that are better taken at national level remain taken at national level, and where we give room for project developers to invest in a clear and predictable framework, so that we get the necessary investments into renewables.
I have many questions, but I think the audience is here also to came here to ask some questions. We also have a Slido code, so people can kind of put a question on my tablet that I can then ask. I unfortunately don't know what the code is for today. /tech energy. Okay, hashtag energy. So but if there is a question in the room, please feel free to go first. If there's none, there is the unavoidable question on nuclear on Slido. So maybe you have a go on that. I think you're prepared for this.
It's great to start with that, because the question is there, and it is an important question. So if I start with our 2050 ambitions, the bigger picture, the strategic objective of becoming climate neutral in 2050, we have done a very in-depth analysis of what does it take to get to 2050, and what is our energy mix going to be over the coming decades in order to be climate neutral in 2050. And there, our analysis, our conclusions are fairly clear, in the sense that we will need significantly higher levels of electrification, as we have talked about. We would need significantly higher levels of renewables. We're going to continue to need molecules in the system. So we're going to need natural gas more or less between now and 2050, but over time that should be replaced by green molecules, by clean molecules. And then we're going to need nuclear as part of our energy system, more or less at the 15% where it is now. And as you know, the 15% are not evenly shared across the European Union. More or less half of the member states have nuclear as part of their electricity mix, and the other half doesn't. And so we see nuclear as part of our 2050 energy mix. Nuclear is carbon-free, and so an important component of that. But again, up to the national governments. The energy mix is a national choice, and so that is a choice of each government. France is a significant nuclear power generating member state, and has been providing exporting electricity over many years, not this last year, and so we're obviously following developments there very, very closely. But in other words, the investment into nuclear that some governments are taking, whether it's France or Poland or others, aligns with the objective of climate neutrality in 2050, and aligns with the objectives for a national energy mix, where we have within that context of a national choice on energy mix, what we have in common, all of us, is we all want to achieve significantly higher levels of renewables in the system and significantly higher electrification, and to be more energy efficient, because otherwise we're not going to achieve our 2050 objectives. But yeah, that's a different matter. So I hope that answered the nuclear question. If not, glad to come back.
There's one question here. Sorry. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. Jakub Gorzkowski, PGE. I have a question regarding the fairness. I'm wondering to what extent these issues should be addressed by the electricity market design reform, and to what extent it should be left to national social policies. As you, Madam Director General, rightly framed this reform into other aspects of the EU policy, but there are also, of course, national policies which to a certain extent want to have this right to assess what is fair in their conditions and environment. So to put it more concrete and refer to the proposal you put on the table, there is this idea to redistribute revenues from the contract for difference among all consumers of energy. Why do you think this is fair, contrary to, for example, an idea to redistribute it only or mostly among vulnerable customers or energy poverty customers, or maybe we should invest at least part of this money into flexibility services or distribution grid in order to let active customers to use their opportunities and to control their energy bills rather than setting the limit of the energy bills for all the customers, doesn't matter how rich they are. Thank you.
Thank you. A good question, and I think really one of the very important issues in the proposals we have made, and one of the issues where I think we're going to have an interesting debate in the coming weeks. So, at a more general level, if I take a step back, our job is to make sure that we create a framework that is conducive to achieving the various objectives, that we have a clear set of rules, predictability for investors, that we help consumers benefit from the lower cost renewables, and that we set the right framework for that at European level. And then a lot of the implementation is typically done at national level. So if you look at the crisis, we created the conditions under which member states could intervene also in prices, and then it was for member states to decide how to do that. One of the challenges we have seen during this crisis was that there were some contracts for difference going back quite a long time. These contracts for difference were drawn up under very different market circumstances. And the result of some of those contracts for difference was that consumers paid very, very high prices, because essentially the model of these contracts for difference was to pay the market plus something to renewable generators. And so, in other words, we had contracts for difference, you had state subsidies going into this generation, but consumers never saw the benefit of that. And that has been one of the very, very problematic aspects of the crisis, and one significant concern among consumers, but also a very significant concern in relation to the energy transition, that consumers never saw the benefit of the renewables. So what does that mean in terms of the incentives and the buy-in, the support for the necessary changes in our energy model that we're seeing? And so that is addressed partly with this specific suggestion that if you have contract for difference and if you have significant revenues from the contract for difference because of market conditions, well, then those revenues need to go back to consumers. The reason that it's then done at that level and in this equal measure across consumers is that in terms of ensuring a level playing field across Europe, but also within member states, then that does seem to be the most sound approach to doing that we don't go out and create problems for competition, fairness across the European Union. And so that has been the analysis leading into this approach. I think there's going to be a debate about that. There's going to be an interesting discussion, but I do think that this is really the response to how do we make sure consumers benefit, how do we make sure there's a level playing field across the European Union, that there's fairness across the European Union.
Good. I think the discussion on online is waking up. So there's a lot of questions. So maybe we can take two from here, one from the audience. The first question: I'm not sure whether the author essentially mean carbon contracts for difference or contracts for difference as they are in the proposal, but I mean, it's also one question that I put in the presentation: to which degree, kind of now formally acknowledging that member states have this tool available to support certain forms of energy with contracts for difference, is essentially shifting the system more towards a state-driven system. What would be your assessment?
So what we see in the current market is that in some member states, in some parts of Europe, there is a significant use of power purchasing agreements. and you see a number of renewables projects going forward without state support. And so when that works, that's a good thing. The market manages that, and these project developers have access to finance via the PPAs. Then you have some projects that would never take off without state subsidy. It can be larger offshore projects that involve several member states. It can be because the upfront investments are more significant. It can be an extension or prolongation of an existing generation capacity. And some of that simply would not happen if you did not have a state subsidy model. And if you have the state aid, then contracts for difference is a way to ensure that the state aid benefits everyone, if you will, that the public support ends up in fair prices for consumers, and that the benefits of that are spread evenly across the European Union. So what we've, yeah.
In one of the several leaks that have appeared in the past week, there was a bit of a table or an indication of kind of some criteria to assess the different tools that has not kind of made it into the final version, or is kind of a bit more spread out. Do you believe, or do you think that maybe in the discussions we are having, we will come up with some sort of menu list for the Commission to eventually check whether certain national incentive schemes are kind of permissible, or do you think that by now putting it in this article, then it's free for all? Member states can essentially do whatever they like to do in terms of contracts for difference. And to give it a bit of a technology turn, sorry for misusing my stage. I mean, I have the worry that if we take two simplistic instruments for contracts for difference, and we just pay for kilowatt hours, we are not getting the right kilowatt hours. We might not get the kilowatt hours from the west-facing solar panels because nobody's investing in them if we just give out the money for bulk kilowatt hours, and we are not getting that for those wind turbines that are standing in locations that have less wind but uncorrelated wind. And I'm somewhat kind of wondering to which degree maybe the Commission would want to kind of give a bit more guidance here.
I think those are very, very good questions. So contract for difference apply when there is state aid involved. If there is state aid, well, then that is subject to European Union state aid rules and approval by the European Commission of specific state aid. And that approval can either be given through some upfront guidance or exemption, some specific regulation, or case by case. And I think it's too early to say how exactly will the guidance be developed, how will that policy develop. It is not appropriate to regulate around it because it is legally the Commission that controls state aid. And so I think we will see once we have the updated market design in place, well, then we will also see what does that mean in a state aid context. And as you know, it's not primarily for DG Energy, that is for DG Competition, and how they intend to develop the state aid review of that. We have a lot of experience in state aid in relation to renewable energy and and nuclear energy for that matter. And we have a lot of experience, including in contract for difference. And so I think there's a good case law, if you will, there's good practice to build on, and we'll see how that fits into this future framework.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Philip. I represent the European Roundtable for Industry, ERT. Thank you for the presentation, and we of course also contributed with a paper. On the whole, we indeed support the main principles, and I did see in the press yesterday, in Politico amongst others, that there remain concerns about the high cost of energy in the EU. And in particular, the energy-intensive industries worry that the cost of energy will remain high in the foreseeable future. They realize, we also realize that not everything can be solved by this market design reform. But what would you answer to alleviate the concerns of heavy industry, steel, cement, chemicals, and others? Because the risk of deindustrialization remains. If it's not via this reform, what other initiatives would DG Energy and the Commission take to reduce the cost of energy in the EU?
Indeed, I think as you're suggesting, it is not only this proposal that we are putting forward to address those very specific concerns. So again, taking a small step back, European energy prices have always been higher than those of our main competitors. If you compare European and American energy prices, there's always been a difference in those for reasons that are partly geological and geopolitical, but there has been a difference there. What we've seen during this crisis is that the differential between our energy prices and the energy prices of competitors and other markets, that difference has increased very, very significantly. And what we saw over the last year was, as part of our demand reduction efforts, we had a combination of, if you will, willed demand reduction, energy savings. That was a very, very good thing. But we also saw demand destruction because some of the energy intensive industries, and that can be larger industries or smaller industries, really had challenges making their business viable in that high cost environment. And so the point you're making on European competitiveness and the concerns around deindustrialization is really an important one. Also in this new energy reality that we are in, we have left the decade of fairly low-priced natural gas being a very significant part of the energy system, and we're entering a number of years where energy prices are expected to stay not as high as they were in 2022 at the peak of it, but that they're expected to stay fairly high. And so there are genuine concerns in relation to what does that mean for European competitiveness? How do we ensure that we stay competitive? And how do we ensure that we stay competitive in sectors that are linked to the energy transition, the net zero technologies, the net zero industries, as well as the energy efficient, the energy intensive industries that you have referred to. So one of the aspects of the response to that concern is, of course, the electricity market design, the way the measures I have mentioned that will help reduce prices, stabilize prices, give more certainty, incentivize investments into renewables. Essentially, the more low-cost renewables we have in the system, the more will we be able to drive prices down. But that's not today and tomorrow. There's a transition, and there's a development and investments that need to take place. But if we can accelerate those investments together with, and that's not part of this package, but if we can accelerate those together with investments into energy efficiencies, then we already have taken a significant step in that direction. What we've seen, and I'm opening a parenthesis, apologies for that, but I think we've seen over this last year also that a number of industries have become a lot more efficient than they were before because the price incentives were simply not there. And that has been quite a significant shift for some that started saying we cannot do this, and a few months later they could do it simply because the price incentives carried some of those energy efficiency and energy efficient technology investments that were needed. So the market design is part of the response, and I think a really critical part of the response to the concerns you have outlined. Together with that, we have today presented a proposal for a net zero industrial act which addresses other aspects of that same issue, really focusing on competitiveness, focusing on creating the right conditions for the development of the net zero technologies across the European Union, and here focusing on those technologies that are directly relevant for the transition so that we do not create new dependencies in relation to those technologies, that we don't just replace our fossil gas dependency on one very large supplier with dependencies on other technologies from other suppliers or dependencies on critical raw materials. That's another proposal that has come forward today. And then the last point I want to make, but I'm really veering far away from the electricity market design, so my apologies, but I just think in relation to energy intensive industries, I think we have had a very significant integration of that concern and those aspects, including into our emissions trading scheme and the way that is designed, as well as the international aspects of the climate policy. So yeah, far away from the electricity market design of today, but just to mention that it is part of those broader measures.
I see we would need much more time to discuss all that, and we have a lot of open questions. I hope that maybe some colleagues from the Commission can also in-slide or provide a few of the answers if they like to. I think to close, maybe one last question from me, and that's maybe one that is interesting also to everybody, is kind of how long do you think we will have this discussion on the proposal? So how smoothly might we get through that, or might we essentially prioritize some parts and others we might take a bit more time? So do you have any visibility on that?
Well, I think we are now in the hands of the two co-legislators. We from the European Commission will work closely with both of them. Our wish, if you will, is that this can go through as quickly as possible. We're not at the peak of the crisis, but we're still in an energy crisis. And I think the sooner we can clarify some of these aspects that linked into investor certainty, how will markets develop, the sooner we can create stability, clarity, predictability around that, the better. We shouldn't leave this open building site out there for too long, because that does risk slowing down investments and slowing down the transition. So we are certainly hoping that the two co-legislators will take this up and address it with speed and a constructive approach in order to have this adopted swiftly. Having said that, and as we've talked about, it is both technically complex and politically challenging, and so we will see. But we are there to help the two co-legislators bring it through as quickly as possible.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.